So welcome. Hello, I'm Dave Bowd, and I'd like to particularly welcome you to this seminar in the Cradle seminar series. It's the one investigating productive feedback practices to facilitate student engagement and learning. I'll be introducing the speakers shortly, but I'd just like to start with acknowledgement of country. Strangely, neither myself nor our speakers are located on any of the lands of Deakin University. Bianca and myself are in different parts of Sydney, and Lasse is joining us from Berlin in Germany. Thus, the slightly later starting time for this event than a normal seminar. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands I'm currently located. I'd like to pay respect to their elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this unceded land. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various ancestral lands from which other attendees join us today, and pay my respects to those other elders, past and present. So today we have two presenters, Dr. Bianca Maleka and Dr. Lasse Jensen. Now, I mention their title because it's a fresh new title. Both of them have recently, last year, completed their PhDs. Both through Cradle, and with Lasse, he was part of a Coaching Hill program, so that's also badged with the University of Copenhagen. Just to introduce briefly our pair and what they're doing now, because we knew what they did in the past. They did a PhD in Cradle. Bianca's currently teaching a direct entry program at the UNSW College in Sydney, where she's worked for some time. She's also a curriculum writer on a pre-master's course that's being developed by the UNSW College and is set to launch early next year. And she's a consultant on a project between various academic teams at UNSW to develop resources to increase student engagement with feedback, which happens to be the topic of her study. Lasse is a postdoctoral researcher now at the University of Copenhagen, and he's primarily working on a large international project called Partnership for Education for Health Professionals, with partners in Denmark, India, and indeed Cradle with Margaret Bierman. His research focuses on the role of generative AI in student-elicited feedback processes. Now, I don't think either of our speakers are going to be talking about Gen AI today, so you may have to restrain your questions on that front to another occasion, which I will mention at the end of the seminar today. So the seminar process is a familiar one. So Bianca will present first for roughly 20 minutes, followed by questions to her, and then she'll hand over to Lasse for the same format. After an hour or on the next hour, I'll close the formal part of the proceedings, but we'll continue discussion with those of you who want to stay a little longer. Now, please place your questions in the Q&A area and not in the chat. If you put them there, it will enable other participants to indicate whether they wish the question to be posed. So it's giving them a tick to your question. That means we take those questions most highly rated first. And please do that all the way through. Don't save them up till the end. The chat section is open for general communications with other participants, as you've been doing so far, but I will ignore any questions posted there. The only questions I will notice are those in the Q&A. So thank you very much for being here, and I'll hand over to Bianca.
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I would like to start by acknowledging the Bidjigal and Gadigal people that are the traditional custodians of the land from which I am speaking today. I would like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. My PhD that I will be sharing with you today was written on this land, and the local bushwalks, local swims, and coastal walks have been key to my mental health and happiness, especially as most of my PhD was written during the pandemic. So the pictures that you will see in my presentation today are the photos of all my favorite places in the local area. Just a small gesture of gratitude for this beautiful land. I would like to thank and acknowledge my supervisors from Cradle, Professor Rola Ajawi, Professor David Boud, and Dr. Joanna Tai. It was a privilege to learn from you and work with you for the 3.5 years. I would also like to thank the education managers from UNSW College, Maria Naidu and Aparna Jacob, as this is where the research was undertaken. Recent feedback research has highlighted the shift in understanding feedback processes, which is reflected in that change in the paradigm shift. The old paradigm that focused on feedback inputs, that is provision of information or comments to students, has been replaced with a new paradigm, which is more focused on interaction, student sense-making, and outputs in terms of student action. So in this understanding, feedback is no longer an episodic practice, it is an integral part of the curriculum. And the quality of student engagement with feedback matters. So their uptake of teacher comments, their sense-making strategies is crucial, is change in the quality of students' work is to happen. Supporting students in developing their feedback literacy is important. Feedback literacy that was defined by Kalles and Boud as the understandings, capacities, and dispositions that are needed to make sense of information and to enhance that in students' work. And if students are to take productive action on feedback, scaffolded feedback designs are needed. The design facilitates a number of features. It creates opportunities to seek and use feedback. It prompts students to take action. So whether that's in the form of rewriting tasks or reflection, and these actions build students' capacity to understand how to create a work that has quality and to build their evaluative judgment. And ipsative feedback is an example of a scaffolded feedback design. It refers to a comparison of a student's current performance with a previous one on a similar task. And much of what we know about ipsative feedback comes from Hughes' research into ipsative assessment. In my first PhD paper, we defined ipsative feedback as learner-centered feedback processes organized across multiple tasks with similar learning outcomes. So stressing the importance of this thorough and scaffolded feedback design. So the overall research question of my thesis was, how do ipsative feedback processes influence students' feedback literacy? And to answer this question, I developed 2 conceptual and 2 empirical papers. And today I want to introduce the empirical research, which answered the questions that you see on screen. So firstly, looking at the impact of ipsative feedback design and in what ways it encourages and improves student action from feedback. And the second study looked at the change in learners' feedback practices as they move across learning settings. The research was conducted with direct entry program at an English language center affiliated with the university. The purpose of direct entry program is to prepare international students for their undergraduate or postgraduate studies at Australian universities. And students who enroll at DEP programs have conditional offers, which means that if they pass the course, they progress to university and they can begin their studies in a variety of disciplines. You can see the participants of my research here on the screen. I've mentioned already that my research happened during the pandemic, hence we've got that distinction into some participants completing and doing the course face-to-face and having the interviews face-to-face, as opposed to the majority of them completing completing the course online. And the study was set within design-based research, and a DBR approach was adopted because the study was in a real educational context, and it aimed to solve the problem that is critical to learning. We also, the research also required that kind of design that will be, that would accommodate cycles of iteration and improvement, and will be responsive to students' changes in feedback practices. And typically DBR has 3 stages. So the first stage is the analysis of a practical problem and development of intervention. Then the cycles, the iterative cycles of testing. So my research happened over 3 cycles where the intervention was refined. And the third stage is a reflection to enhance the implementation of the intervention. And this research used an e-portfolio as a tool to implement ipsative processes. And that e-portfolio was designed for a number of its affordances. Firstly, the structural conditions, in order to include ipsative feedback processes, both teachers and students need to have access to past tasks, to past work and feedback. And the e-portfolio gives ready access to those tasks that are sequential. It also included a number of points for student action. So the students were encouraged to formulate learning goals prior to writing a given task. There was systematic reflection on how they performed with regards to their own goals, but also reflection on feedback and an opportunity for peer feedback. And of course, the teacher action. It was, in this course, it was the teacher who was providing comments on the incremental progress from task to task and providing personalized feedback in e-portfolio. I conducted 2 sets of semi-structured interviews that were held approximately 1 year apart, and analyzed student artifacts, so students' e-portfolios and teachers' field notes. So what are the effects of ipsative feedback design? So the first, the key feature of ipsative feedback design is a comparison. It's a comparison of 2 or more samples of students' work. In this intensive course, such a comparison was undertaken by a teacher on a weekly basis and was guided by the task requirements and also standards for that particular task. And to form such a comparison, the teacher had to look back at students' work. The teacher could also look at students' learning goals or reflection and identify the areas to comment on. And as comparisons are inherent in that design, they encourage learners to make them systematically. So students talked about frequent rereading of their past work and feedback to guide them in the completion of the new task. So as one participant mentioned, looking up at previous articles and teachers' comments help us to avoid some errors we make. And the students mentioned frequently forming the learning goals based on the feedback they received the previous week. The comments focus on improvements or their lack between tasks. And when reading feedback comments framed in this way, students could see where they improved, in which areas they improved, and which were still problematic. So, of course, any good feedback practice should help learners make sense of their performance at a task so that the subsequent performance can be enhanced. What ipsative offers is that clear articulation of how the performance has been improved since the previous task, and perhaps if it hasn't, what could be their recurring issues. And the students had a clear understanding of, or they were evaluating their learning more explicitly. They would say, oh, I've noticed that numbers of errors reduced, or I've improved my academic style, or I've used more advanced sentence structures in subsequent tasks. So they were encouraged to monitor and evaluate their learning. And some students appreciated the practices that they developed during the intervention, and they were keen to continue to use them. So the practices and the ipsative feedback has built students' learning their feedback histories. Two participants from one cycle mentioned that once they moved to a subsequent course, they continued with some practices. As you can see in the quote here, in the following course, there was no expectation to, for example, rewrite work. But because from the experience that they saw that the practice was beneficial, they continued to do so. And this finding was actually a catalyst in that second empirical work, where I wanted to explore that idea of the change of feedback practices and the influences on students' feedback practices as they move across courses. Because students' prior experiences with feedback can shape their engagement with in other contexts. So the feedback histories can be conducive, as in the case of that participant that I just mentioned, or hindering to learning in new contexts. And those experiences of different feedback histories are especially clear and relevant in the stories of international students. They have diverse feedback expectations and also different understandings of their roles in feedback. And I see that quite often in the classes that I teach, where I have students from, for example, five different countries, 5 different educational systems, and I can see how they approach and negotiate their roles differently. In our courses, we are with students for a brief amount of time. After that, they move on to subsequent courses where they are exposed to different feedback practices. Those different feedback practices are influenced by disciplinary learning and teaching, and those different understandings of what constitutes quality. The plural term of feedback literacy has been used to actually denote this complex system of literacies and to account for the experiences that are socially situated. And so my second empirical work looked at how learners' feedback practices change across learning contexts. And it was conducted with the same participants as the same study. And we interviewed the participants about their feedback practices in 3 learning contexts: their undergraduate studies, the direct entry program, and the postgraduate courses at UNSW. So what did we find? We found that there's some learners could make use of the affordances in the context and draw on their feedback histories to build feedback opportunities. This is especially true in contexts where feedback practices are deficient. So the student mentioned here that there was not enough feedback, not enough comments from the teachers, so they used an e-portfolio with peers. So students can establish informal feedback networks or seek feedback if there is not enough opportunities in the course, which is a clear expression of their feedback literacy. Now, when the participants moved to new courses, they were exposed to new feedback practices. They were exposed to new practices that were perhaps more directly influenced by respective disciplines. There were some examples of students continuing with beneficial practices. So they've they've used the practices that worked in previous contexts, such as here, goal setting. But there was also some evidence of students being passive and not necessarily engaging with feedback. This was especially clear in the contexts where tasks were only followed with grades rather than any kind of comments or follow-up or scaffolded tasks. So overall, learners come to our courses, to the setting where we are, with a baggage of their feedback histories. Now, these feedback histories are then continue to be influenced by diverse institutional, disciplinary, and pedagogical practices that include, as you can see here, the delivery mode, the teacher literacy, the task design, and so on and so forth. And then they form new sets of feedback practices and literacies that they then continue to take to different courses. So they can draw on their feedback histories to create more learning-focused feedback conditions. So the feedback histories are composed of this range of influences that extend over a period of time and are quite dynamic and nuanced. So what are the implications of this research? Firstly, I want to talk about comparisons. They're crucial in the design of the feedback. The inclusion of comparison processes in the curriculum, so designing tasks with explicit comparisons, and against a range of different reference, whether that's students' past work, whether that's the rubric or the models, peer work. The students also compare the affordances of the settings, so including the comparisons and showing how to effectively make those comparisons would be quite important. The implementation of recursive and iterative cycles of ipsative feedback, especially in those early stages of students' academic learning, whether that's in undergraduate or first-year programs, diploma courses, because this is a scaffolded feedback design, it really allows students, equips students with a number of strategies that they can then perhaps draw on as they continue to move on. And dedicated classroom time to discuss students' feedback histories and feedback expectations. We talk about students' prior learning. We have different tools and mechanisms to check where they are in terms of their learning, so that they are prepared for the assessment. I think discussing students' feedback expectations, students' responsibilities, the practices that they considered helpful in previous context can help to understand our shared experience, our shared responsibilities in the process and feedback expectations. And so that really calls for this greater dialogue between teachers and educational designers, curriculum writers, as I think sometimes feedback practices between different courses can be as different as between different educational contexts. So having a more understanding of how the practices are designed would be helpful. And I would like to finish with some ideas, some directions for further studies that emerged from my research. So exploring cognitive and affective processes during comparison making. I know there is some work done by Nicole and other researchers in that area. I think it is an exciting research direction to look at how students are engaging with comparison making and what actually happens during those and the sense making strategies. Also, the longitudinal research into students' experiences of interacting with feedback tools and materials in different contexts across different settings. And finally, investigating the cultural diversity of feedback conventions and different educational systems. And I think on that note, and with a photo of a beautiful blue groper that, if you're lucky, you can see when you are diving in my local swimming hole, I would like to thank you all for listening. Yeah, I think and hand over to you, Dave.
Okay, thank you very much, Bianca, for that really clear exposition of some of the work that you've done. Going to the Q&A, can I just remind people that if you click on the thumbs up, it will raise the priority of the question to the top, if that's a question that you would like answered. So maybe we go to the first one here from SM Bennett. Re-portfolio, did you use existing software or design something specific?
Thank you. So no, there was the ePortfolio plug that was available on Moodle was not exactly what I needed. So I designed a specific ePortfolio for what I wanted it to do. So initially it was embedded in the discussion board, and students had to download it every week and then upload it. And after the first cycle, I've noticed that there were actually problems. Students were posting things in the wrong discussion board threads. So we moved into using the Google Drive, the Google Share, for the document to be open access so that students could look at the work of their peers. But essentially, the ePortfolio was designed from scratch by myself.
Good, thank you. The second one is a more conceptual nature from Bats Trimbos. Comparison is key in ipsative feedback processes. How does ipsative feedback relate to Nicole's internal feedback? I think you've mentioned that in passing, but maybe you could focus on that a little more.
Sorry, Dave, can you repeat? I couldn't hear that question.
Oh, comparison is key in ipsative feedback processes. How does ipsative feedback?
Oh, yes, I see from Basque. Yes.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah. Look, I think the feedback in the study that I did, that comparison was initially undertaken by a teacher. The teacher that had to compare the samples of students' work. Now, if the students are doing those comparisons themselves, that is essentially an internal feedback. They are drawing on the similarities and differences between the two tasks and how they performed at that task. So I believe it is for me, if students are making a comparison, if they are looking at how they've reached the standards for a particular task, they are using the processes that I believe Nicole considers internal feedback. That's my understanding. And that comparison essentially is a way of internalizing or operationalizing the feedback processes.
Yeah, so you're saying that basically it wasn't part of your design in order to focus on that you can notice the opportunities for internal feedback in the processes that you've established, even though they were ostensibly about teacher feedback. That's
right. And so the students were there were no prompts, so to say, in the ePortfolio to compare. There was nowhere in the course that we talked about comparisons, but students, when interviewed, they were actually talking about making those comparisons themselves. So yes, it was not in any way designed by me.
Good. One more quick question, and then we'll move on. You can still prioritize these questions for our general discussion afterwards, so don't ignore them when we come back to some of them. So final one from Linda Houghton. Can you speak a little more about the role of cultural norms ethnic values or beliefs that impact students' engagement with feedback. I think the implication here is that students with different backgrounds might, engage and conceptualize feedback quite differently from each other. Did you notice that?
I don't think it was particularly visible in how students were engaging with feedback. I think when we talk about engagement, we tend to think about the capacity. So we need to provide the design. There needs to be opportunities for action, but then also needs to be willingness. So I do admit that there were some students that were not willing to be engaged with the e-portfolio to the same extent as other students were. These students were from the same cultural background. They were from, as you could see, they were all Chinese. So I don't think I could make any generalizations about the students approaching those tools differently based on their prior experiences or where they were from.
Yeah, you can't draw that kind of conclusion from such a small study.
No.
There's an interesting question about workload coming up, but I'm afraid we're going to save that because we're now going to move over to Lasse and his presentation. So continue to post your questions in the forum. If you would particularly like Bianca or Lasse to respond to your question, then do indicate that when you post your question. So over to you, Lasse.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Thank you, Bianca, first of all. That was really interesting. And I'm also glad I went second because now I know that you all understand the difference between the old and the new feedback paradigm. So I don't need to go so much into detail about this. Basically, as Dave also said in the beginning, I was so lucky to do
I'm afraid we've lost you, Lasse. Yes, in all the times when we were having supervision on this link, it seemed to be pretty stable. But just when there's a presentation, it seems to cut out. I don't think there's anything we can do except to wait a little while for Lasse to log in again, I think is what he's doing. Whilst that's happening, maybe Bianca could answer that question about workload. Basically, does what you engaged in feedback increase staff workload?
Yeah. I was just typing an answer, but I'll answer live. So I think there are two questions that are related. One, whether the teacher continued to provide ipsative feedback after the PhD study, and the second one about workload. Shall we?
No, finish your sentence.
Yeah,
and then when you finish your sentence, we'll come back to Lasse.
Yeah. So to answer the first question, no, the teacher did not continue to provide ipsative feedback. However, the e-portfolio became part of the course. So the e-portfolio was used throughout the course, and students were working with the e-portfolio. In terms of the workload, I think, well, there is definitely more work because you are looking, essentially, as a teacher, you're looking at 2 samples of student work, and it is more time consuming initially. Once you get to know students and get to know their weaknesses and what the problem is, and this study was undertaken with students in a small class, so it was one teacher, so quite very good conditions to actually establish rapport and to know students. This becomes easier, as with any feedback practice, as you continue to apply it, it becomes easier, and then the students become more used to it. And so that workload, I think, initially, yes, it is higher, but I think that it decreased with time.
Thank you. Can we go back to Lasse now? As your connection seems to be not as good as it used to be. You're on mute, Lasse. That's it.
Okay, now.
Yep.
I hope it works this time. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm just going to start on my second slide now. I also did a thesis by publication with 4 papers. I also have 2 empirical papers in it. And is it doing it again? No. And these are also the ones I will present today. Those are the 2 ones at the bottom here. The first one basically looks at how can we analyze data about feedback in online learning, and the second one then tries to use that framework that I developed in the first of those two papers to analyze basically what matters for like what characteristics of like impactful or productive feedback can we find in this. Just see. So I'm a bit confused here. Okay. So just why even look at this? Generally, I listed like 4 reasons here, and the first 3 are like the very the foundation for a lot of the current feedback thinking there, which Bianca also works within. You could say the new feedback paradigm. It is that feedback is one of the most impactful or powerful practices you can do in education, but at the same time, it often fails to be powerful. And then this like insight that this issue stems from the fact that we're very preoccupied with what the student does, or what the teacher does in creating and transferring comments about student work, and not so much about what the student do with the work to learn. So that's basically the background for why looking at this. As Bianca also says, has like more traditional understanding on old paradigm, and then a newer paradigm understanding, where the old one basically sees feedback as a transfer of information, which is also the same way that we might see it when we talk about it in everyday life. And then we can say like a newer conceptualization, where we try to see feedback as a student-led process. What I want to just say about this difference is that it also changes a lot how we can research feedback, because in a traditional understanding, you could see that feedback impact was then very much dependent on like how is it transferred, or like what is the content of the message that you're getting from in your comments from the teacher. Whereas like the new paradigm, you have to like look at all the you can say like the meaning making process of the student. That involves a lot of contextual factors, and it just means that feedback should be you could say observed in its natural habitat, or like how it really unfolds in naturalistic studies. Also like Bianca did, where you use design-based research to see like this is a natural way of students using feedback, and not so experimental, because the experimental one might like, you can say, rule out some of these contextual factors that are so important for the student learning. But all in all, you could say that it makes empirical research much more complex to do it within this paradigm. So I've listed like the first 3 bullets here, like some of the, you could say, requirements that I was looking for, like when I was looking for a good methodology to look at this. And digital ethnography, which is what I ended up doing, is of course by no means the only way of looking at feedback under the new feedback paradigm, but I think it has some advantages that that makes it particularly like useful for our case. The first one is that it really highlights the insider perspective and student narratives, which of course is very useful when you are looking at students' meaning making of feedback and students' use of feedback. That's something that's very different from, for instance, like very frequently used like learning analytics, which don't really have this like insider perspective from the students. The other one is that digital ethnography can draw on ethnography's tradition for rigor and ethics and reflexivity, and that's maybe also something that puts it a little bit apart from many other, you could say, qualitative digital methods. So I did digital ethnography fieldwork, and this is just a bit about the setting and the study participants. I collected data from 6 courses, 3 in Copenhagen and 3 at Deakin, from 18 study participants. And this is like, the fieldwork was just before the lockdown. So this is like online learning before the lockdown. So it's not this synchronous, very Zoom or Teams based online learning, but more this asynchronous like model that's been also quite used, probably still is quite used, where the students are more solitary and learn in their own time, and there are a few maybe synchronous things, but most of the things are actually themselves just working their way through like an LMS. Because of this flexibility, I guess the study participants I had were also, a lot of them were non-traditional. That is like students who really like benefited from the flexibility offered by this kind of learning, where they would maybe already have like, they'd be part-time students, work next to the things, or have little children at home and other responsibilities, or they might have like already studied something else, had another career, and then went back to study. The data was collected, as I said, in 2019, just before the lockdown. I collected observational data. All the observations were digital. It all came from like inside the course rooms of the 6 courses. Basically a lot of discussion forum posts, but also the documents and the student work. And then for some courses, I had access to learning analytics on the study participant level, which means that I could basically go and see like the interactions that I registered in this kind of dashboard in there. Also field notes, and did interviews with them all. That's, I guess, the more interesting part here is I did the longitudinal audio diaries, which is a way of like collecting like student narratives in the period between the interviews. You could say that's how I used them. So I knew, of course, the course plans for all the courses, and I also knew about what the students were doing from talking to them. So basically, I could make this plan where I prompted them for their reflections on specific things at times when I knew that they had just had some kind of interaction, where I assumed there would be some kind of feedback interaction in it. There could be that they just got comments back from a teacher. It could be I had seen in the discussion forum that they were asking a question, and there were many different like instances. It was like very time consuming to do this with 18 students, because you had to follow each of them individually, but it gave like really nice data from like what happened like along the journey of them learning in the course, and not just what I found in the interviews. This, of course, produced like a very kind of like, you could say, like a messy data set of lots of different kinds of data, many different students, many different times from different courses. And I tried to do a semantic analysis first, and basically just coding for like different feedback practices, technology, student use, and things from the literature. But it didn't, or how can I say, it would probably have been helpful if I had looked at something very specific, for instance, like how does online quizzes influence student motivation and stuff. And then I could have like singled in on that and coded for that. But because I was trying to look at the whole from the student perspective of feedback as in online learning, so it's like very broad and many different processes, then it actually didn't bring much clarity to do a semantic analysis. So instead, I looked to like one of the people I really admire in this field, which is Rachel Esterhazy, who wrote like beautiful work on from the new feedback paradigm perspective on empirical, basically did empirical studies with this. And she has this concept called a notion called the feedback encounter. So I borrowed that one and made like a slightly different definition that's a bit more like strict than the one she uses. That's the one I put here on this slide. Basically, I needed that to be able to identify in this messy data set, to identify all the feedback encounters that students have had. And you can see here from the definition, basically it's any interaction that students may have with other persons or artifacts which are relevant to the students' work and which help them address one of the 3 feedback questions. And those are the ones from Hattie and Timberlake: where am I going, how am I doing, and where to next. I identified that I used this, you could say, the process in the 3 blue boxes here to get to the 80 feedback encounters. And the ones, like just to give a feeling for the ones that I ended up with, are like extremely diverse group of what a feedback encounter is. It's like based on a lot of interactions with other students or with teachers. Can be like them showing their work to a colleague. They could be them asking friends and family for things related to their work. Can be talking to study support staff, which is something Deakin offers, where people can get like writing support if it's like a written assignment. It's also individual use, or more, you can say, inner feedback or self-generated feedback, things where students use exemplars of rubrics, for instance, to compare their own work and then do edits or like whatever, like develop the understanding of what they're doing through this process. Of course, interactions with quizzes, materials, and online tools such as like plagiarism checkers or spell checkers, and yeah, many kinds of encounters that have a feedback function, you could say. Then we had these 80 encounters, and basically when you compare the encounters, it becomes quite clear that they're used very differently by the students depending on who initiates the encounter. And that led us to this, like you can say, these 3 categories of feedback encounters. And the elicited, the formal, and the incidental encounters. The elicited ones are the most, like the broadest category as well, and it's like the most common type. You can see here my examples are, it's like both what help seeking or feedback seeking, Bianca just called it, or it's also self-generating feedback, which is more like the maybe relying on the inner feedback processes. What is common for them is that they're all initiated by the students, so the students feel like they're very much in control of them, and because of this control, of course, it also often matches the student needs. So the student will think that it's relevant, basically. It's relevant for their work, what they get out of this kind of feedback encounter. Then you have the formal feedback encounters. Those are the encounters that we normally consider to be like feedback. It's like feedback processes or encounters that are like baked into the course design. For instance, like now you get comments on this assignment you submitted, or there's a peer assessment process built into the course, or quizzes, etc. These are low in student control, and quite often the students report that they don't really match their feedback needs that they have. They're also quite different from the elicited, in that with elicited encounters, the student can choose basically to expose themselves, to share their work. In formal encounters, you always share your work, and then the comments are relating to your work or your performance. In elicited encounters, quite often student would just say, I'm struggling with this thing, and they would like formulate a question to some person or in the forum, and then basically kind of like without showing what they can do, or like what they have done or what their draft look like or what their thinking is, they can basically generate feedback that way. So it's a bit more, you could say there's many more emotions in the formal feedback encounters than there are in the illicit feedback encounters. Then the third kind, incidental feedback encounters, these are probably the most surprising to many of you. That's the feedback encounters that are like unplanned and unintended. That means they're not in the course design and they're not something the student seeks out. They just happen. That's quite often happens. Like the examples here, like when you overhear like a teacher talk to another student and you realize, that's actually also relevant for my work. Or even when you talk to students and hear other students talk, I really struggled with this task, and you realize, I didn't struggle, maybe I'm doing it wrong, and you actually return to it and basically use that information that you randomly came across to work. It happens a lot in forums when you study online, but it's the most rare of these three kinds in my data set, but I assume that they will be much more prevalent if you are either in like on-site courses where you basically hang out with students who are studying the same thing as you, and you just like overhear much more informal interactions, or in online courses where there are very strong social design. So you have group work or you have to present to each other. That, of course, will give more opportunities to incidental feedback encounters. This was just like a very quick overview of the third paper. Basically, the framework also has some other elements, and you're welcome to ask about it. But I just wanted to get through this to get to the second paper where we use basically this notion of feedback encounter to ask like a more specific research question. And that is, we're looking for patterns in the data to see what characterizes a productive feedback encounters. So what we did is basically a big table with like 80 rows, one for each feedback encounter, and then basically coding or extracting data about all these different elements I have listed up over here. This makes it possible for us to, for instance, see if you have for instance, the subset of encounters where the students complain. It's very vague. I don't really know what to do with this. What characterizes these ones? What is it a certain timing? Is it with certain participants? What type of encounter? Is it typically elicited or formal or incidental? Does it align with previous encounters? So there's basically we start looking for patterns in related to what impact it has and the student reports it has. What we found, or some of the things we found, was that almost all encounters actually have an impact on students, but the vast majority of them had what we then call instrumental impact, a very superficial impact. That means that they're not actually associated with any deeper thinking or reflections. It might not even be associated with so much learning. But of course, a slightly better understanding, it can be stuff like you need to add subheadings to your text or remove that figure, and various things that you can just do without actually like you can say challenging the assumptions that you brought to the thing. Then we have fewer feedback encounters that had what we call substantive impact, which is basically where the students feel that their understanding that they basically brought to the work are being challenged, and it requires much more critical reflections to make sense of. This is a sense-making process again, to make any sense or make meaning of the comments. And these ones are associated with more like significant changes to their work or thinking, or they start working in a new way, adopting a new strategy. You could say then, of course, should we then just always challenge the student assumptions and we get like very impactful feedback? And obviously, it doesn't work this way. There's like a lot of instances where the students do not take up the challenge. You could say, even though that there's clearly like they're clearly being challenged at the assumptions in the feedback encounter, they might only focus on the simple corrections if they're getting like kind of like a mixed bag of like add some new headings and also like rethink the way you're structuring your whole thing. And they just focus on the simple ones, or something we saw quite often. Or they will say like, the more challenging ones are, I don't know what to do with them. They would also quite often say this. Then we started looking for different, what are there any like characteristics or patterns for like when students then accept challenges? And one of the things we found that is that timing played quite a big role, because students' feedback needs change over time. And so I put this figure in here, like with the red arrows. Basically, it illustrates like a student working on one task, and then how the feedback need changes during the work on the task. And this might be quite straightforward, that in the beginning of, just before starting or in the beginning of working on the task, they're much more open to challenging feedback encounters. That also means they would interpret an encounter in a different way than they would just before submitting, where they have much more instrumental feedback needs and just need to check the thing. And this general like move from like an openness towards challenges towards more instrumental feedback needs is seen across all types of encounters. So it's not just the comments you get from your teacher. It's also like how you use a rubric or how you use an exemplar. You can see like what's on the surface is kind of like the same encounter is just very different when the students get to control it. Where in the beginning they will, for instance, with an exemplar, read it and be more like inspired by it, or maybe I misunderstood that, and like be ready to kind of like really learn from this this inner feedback process. They can sit with a rubric on exemplar before submitting, and just like it's a checklist for them. Tick, tick, tick. I did this. I did this. I did this. And actually, you can when you look at it afterwards, and they can also see that they have like huge blind spots. They almost just check it to approve that it was correct, and actually don't really pick up on the things where there would be some like more critical thing that you could work on. What this also means, of course, is that feedback leads are somewhat predictable. So it also has some consequences for like feedback designs. That, of course, we've long said that we need to move comments on work to when the students can use them, and not just like put all the most formative comments when there's no use for them anymore. But it also matters when in the process it is. These courses that we looked at were all like actually had really good feedback designs, and they had like this kind of like cascading tasks where one task was feeding into the next. So just for the purpose that the comments you get after submitting a task would be relevant to the next task. And what actually we saw quite often is that the students then complained that they knew that, and they were like, but then I can't start my next task until I have my comments. So for them, it's always like it's a timing effect. Is like the current task they're working on. It can be the next task, or it could be the task that they are in some stage of the process of working on. This is just like an overview of like contributions. I think like most of it here, of course, is that most of my point is that it's super complex to research feedback processes if you really want to like include the contextual factors in the analysis. There's a lot of it becomes very messy, and I think like some of this one of the points of this work is to try and like make a simpler way of like thinking about this kind of data and like understanding this kind of data, and also like a structured way you can analyze it. Then I also think like a contribution is to basically go on the student perspective and see like what are all the things that all the feedback processes a student participate in, and not be so devoted to just the feedback processes where the teacher plays a big role, but basically as a student, and why did you change that? How did you change that? And then see the many different kinds of processes they participate in. And then I think that, as I said, like this is useful for addressing specific questions. And then basically the bottom bullet points here are more like the empirical contribution, you could say, where a lot of it, of course, is just adding empirical evidence to things that's already been said by other researchers, or like just like adding a little bit to what's already been said, especially like the role of timing as relative to the current work is something that's already been mentioned earlier, also by Dave. And but this is basically, it came out of the data here. So now we have also empirical evidence for this. Some of the stuff that might be a bit newer is about the incidental feedback, and also about the elicited feedback, and these challenges with like the student control, and the student control actually would lead to more instrumental impact in some situations. Just to not go too much over time, just check.
Yeah, you need to wind up.
This is my final slide, and actually maybe I don't go through this one because I can just like leave it here for a second, and then if anyone has any questions related to implications for practice, we can. I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much, Lasse. I think one of the notable things about your study is that of all the feedback encounters you identified, less than a third are associated with what we conventionally think of as feedback. That is feedback within the old paradigm of feedback processes. So we've really shifted there. So only a couple of questions in the Q&A for you, but we will do put in more questions if you have them, and we'll continue them after the break. So before we break, I'll ask Lasse to address the first one from David Carless. How do elicited feedback encounters relate to the broader concept of feedback seeking? What might be distinctions between the two? I don't know, maybe it is like very, very much the same. I think that elicited feedback encounters maybe has, I could say, like a challenge with that concept is that it includes, it focuses a lot of like the student takes initiative, so it includes the self-generated one with materials, as well as like basically help seeking or feedback seeking. And I think and there's actually like quite a big difference in how the students experience it, if it's something that they self-generate with like a rubric or exemplar, and something that another person participates in. So I don't know if that could be a difference, that it has like this even broader scope. I don't know if you also consider, for instance, like comparing with an exemplar as feedback seeking.
'Cause in that case, I don't think there's a big difference between them.
Thank you. Can I just pause to draw an end to the formal part of the session and thank our speakers. So what we normally do is we pause here to allow people that need to leave on the hour, but we will continue informally for as many questions as people want to ask for the rest of our time, up for another half an hour. So thank you very much, Bianca. Thank you very much, Lasse, for two very stimulating presentations that have got a lot of food for thought in them. Before I go back to the questions, I'm just posting in the chat now the notices for the next two Cradle seminars. The next one is from Zhang Yang from the Education University of Hong Kong, who'll be with us in person but presenting online on the 31st of May on an ecological interpretation of Hong Kong undergraduates' perceptions of feedback literacy. So another feedback seminar. And then one after that is on the 5th of June, which is one of these TEXA Cradle seminars on ChatGPT. That's on the impact of ChatGPT on higher education. What have we learned? Implications of generative artificial intelligence for higher education. So I posted in the chat where you can get further information about that. So thank you very much for that. So let's return now to the questions. So we start with the questions for Lasse, and then I'll open it up. So the top of the top one here is from Jan Duxbury Roberts. Lasse, do you know whether any of the peer feedback encounters occurred in so-called formal peer-assisted learning sessions outside of class, or whether they were all more informal?
I think if the students meet up on their own and like chat with each other and like show each other work, I would consider it elicited feedback and not a formal feedback encounter. But the students did that, and I think that's there was also a lot of so this also shows that there's a lot of like student preference or behavior in this, because some students just seek out a lot more elicit feedback much more and like collaborate much more than other students who are more who just like only do the formal ones and like learn very much on their own.
So were formal peer learning activities a feature of the courses you looked at?
Very little. I think they were like and I think that's also part of this, that because that makes them a little bit more synchronous, and they were really highlighting the asynchronous nature of this. So, but there was some peer learning, but they didn't have group work to collaboration and stuff like this in the courses.
Thank you. So there's a question which Bianca answered from her study, from Anik Day. Did any of them mention research papers delve into the background and upbringing of the student from different nationalities and how it impacts their feedback and thought in general? Now, Lasse, you had a Australian-Denmark comparison, but you could argue that the cultures aren't that hugely different. But did you notice much?
What I noticed a lot was that, I mean, actually in the students from the Danish courses, there were no Danish students randomly that volunteered. But what I did notice was that students at Deakin were much more, had a much more advanced understanding of what feedback is, in a way, which I think is maybe from other courses, or maybe it's much more spoken about, like feedback is for you and for your. I didn't have to turn them towards like the new feedback paradigm so much as I needed with the students at the Danish courses. So that was definitely, you could call it a cultural thing, but I think it was maybe not their cultural background, but maybe more the university they enrolled at. So there was some difference in this.
Yeah, I think there are multiple factors we need to consider, as Bianca identified.
If I might just respond to that question as well, because my students were from different nationalities. They were all Chinese, and what I noticed was that especially when the students were talking about undergraduate studies and their experiences in the undergraduate context, they were mostly familiar with the transmission focused and the kind of older paradigm of feedback. So a lot of the learning focused feedback approaches that they saw at the direct entry program or later on at university were quite new. So they said quite often that they never formulated goals. They never actually were encouraged to reflect on feedback. So a lot of these practices were new to them. But in terms of a kind of, getting a bit more understanding as to how it differs among cultures, my study did not go there. This was just one of the findings that I could see that the students would say that a lot of these practices were new to them, so they were not familiar with them.
Yeah, well, anyone out there who wants to do some research studies, there's a wonderful one to be done about cultural difference and feedback. So do think about that and pass on the message. Another question from David Carlos. I might put it to both of you, starting with Lasse. What feedback literacies do students need to make the most of feedback encounters?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think definitely, for instance, with incidental feedback encounters, for instance, they have the potential to really be like quite challenging, because the students, of course, they only count as incidental if someone sees them as feedback. So it's quite often like really big things like, oh my God, I misunderstood the whole thing, or there's a much better way of doing this, or like, so quite often people reported like quite big effects from incidental encounters, but only some students had them. Like a lot of students never had any behaviors that made it possible to have an incidental encounter. They never lurked around in the forums and never met up with other students. They basically just, so there's kind of like, I don't know if that counts as a feedback literacy, but basically opening yourself up for the opportunity for this is like, it's almost like it's like a preference for students. Do they like to see other students present their things, and do they reflect on how so there's something about like seeing the relevance for your own work and opening yourself up for like these kind of like random things happening. So there's a big one. And of course the elicited, that's also like being able to like ask for help is of course also like when you need it and use it is of course also a form of like feedback literacy.
Just related to that, I mean, did the students themselves talk in terms of feedback when they were talking about things other than the formal feedback encounters, or was it just something they did?
Some started doing it because some kind of like changed their way of looking at feedback just through the conversations with me, because they could see like what I was going for. I didn't explain anything about like feedback processes to them, but they could tell I was interested in these kind of things, and that's like, that changed how I was working with this. But sometimes I would go backwards and say like, you had this effect. What did that come from? And then they would say like, I overheard this. So it was like almost like looking for the missing influence sometimes, where they would say like, but then they would just like throw away. I found out that I should do this. Like, how did you find that out? And then they might talk about something that was more incidental.
Yeah. Bianca, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I was thinking about the emotional aspect of feedback literacy, which I guess is what you mentioned, Lasse, is opening up yourself and being eager to receive criticism and being eager to receive comments on one's work. So I think that emotional aspect of feedback literacy would be quite important in terms of feedback encounters and those incidental ones. I don't know. We generally talk about just feedback literacy or feedback literacies, but I don't know whether we have emotional feedback literacy passive active feedback literacy or any kind of distinctions within the feedback literacy concept. I'm thinking more about, the literacies in general. You've got your assessment literacy, digital literacy, and so on. I think in terms of feedback, I am more thinking about what students do and what capacities they need to have. So they need to be they need to value feedback. They need to be open for criticism, as we said. They need to work with the different ways of judging of their work. So I think it's all those different actions that students, the dispositions that they need to have, that probably would be important for incidental encounters.
Yeah. The next question is one that I think I want to put to both of you. You can choose which one starts on this. And it's a very contentious one. It goes back many, many decades, this question, and it's still something that people get into disputes about. How important do you think praise is as part of formal feedback?
I might just answer this question with reference to my research. So I think in my research, the praise was expressed through articulation of improvement. So telling students how their work has improved and showing evidence of that improvement is very important for the ipsative process, because that's the comparison and showing of progress is only possible. It's framed with regards to improvement or its lack. So I would say that for ipsative, talking about students' improvement is very important. I think it is important for any feedback process, but perhaps you can't really talk about improvement if you only look at one task. You can only talk about improvement if you are comparing, right? Or if you have some kind of reference. So we can talk about how well students are meeting the guidelines for the task and task requirements and how they're exhibiting standards, which I think, is that counts as praise. But I think in ipsative, that idea of expressing and articulating improvement is what makes this kind of feedback practice different to any others.
Yeah. Lasse, do you want to tackle the P word, the contentious P word?
I would say that the times when praise came up, the students were very happy to tell me about it, and they never complained about getting praise. I don't know how it influenced their understanding of the learning, but there was definitely they really saw that as like very feedbacky, like very typically for feedback would be like something that really judges like, oh, you were very good. So this was, I think they were maybe like, I wasn't so interested in it, and I think they wanted to tell me more about it than I wanted to hear, was maybe my feeling for this. So
there does seem to be some evidence that inauthentic praise not attached to the qualities of students' work, isn't helpful and can be counterproductive. So there's a really burgeoning literature out there, which I encourage people to look at, that there are situations in which praise might be more justifiable than others, but it is generally less justifiable than is generally believed and generally utilized. But that's my take on the praise work.
What I did, if I can add something to this, because what I did see is that when students, if it was comments on written work, it often has like something very instrumental, something very like substantive and different things and some praise. And what I did definitely notice is that if the most important like substantial things are hidden among other things, then it's easier for the students to ignore them. Then they hang on to I used this feedback, I really thought about it and took it in. So somehow it can overshadow, if you give like very comprehensive feedback, it can overshadow some of the parts that you actually maybe, as the person who gives the comments, would think is the most important.
Well, that relates to the question from Sue Hackett, which a kindly person has passed on from the chat section, but Sue's reposted it herself. Did the students, and I think it's primarily for you, Lasse, did the students comment on the quality of the feedback? That is, could they identify the difference between superficial and more in-depth feedback? And could they judge whether it actually helped them improve in real terms? So you've identified like the instrumental and the more substantive, but did you follow through on that? And
what they would then identify is whether it was like useful for them or not. I think I think it's also important to, sometimes students have very instrumental needs, and they what they really didn't want was getting like stuff that didn't answer like the immediate need. There was a lot of situations where they were like, it would be very simple things like the word count or how do I shorten my assignment, and then they would get the feedback, like the comments they would get back is like very complex about like how to think of it, like it's a whole new way. And they were like, this I cannot use for anything. But of course I get that they also of course think a lot about the output they have to produce in a way. So I don't know if that's like a bit like counter to actually learning from it. But they did have many opinions about it. One of the things that often came up is like if they felt like the one who commented on their work was a little bit, it's so easy to make that comment, but you don't have to do the work, kind of like there was almost like a fairness in it. If it could also seem unfair somehow, the feedback, if it wasn't actually like saying, but what do I have to do? And like it wasn't productive or like concrete enough for them.
So, and I think you also mentioned in your presentation that the issue of timing and context was very important here. That there were lots of occasions on which it doesn't matter how useful, how substantive, how worthwhile the comments were, they were just timed at such a period in which students actually couldn't engage with them or take them up.
Yeah.
Okay. Another one here. Are students more receptive to receiving feedback when giving feedback is encouraged and acted upon? That is, the teacher asks for feedback about the course and their delivery, for example, throughout the teaching period, as opposed to just at the end. So this is feedback to teachers, not just feedback to students. I believe creating a safe and supportive online learning environment is extremely important with feedback. So I think the question is really getting at, if the teacher models getting feedback from students, does that encourage students to take feedback from teachers more seriously? Apologies if I've mistraced that.
Well, I guess, any kind of interrogation of students, of how students see our courses and our feedback practices is important, because it can allow us to make improvements. Now, of course, what we want from our students is action and immediate action, so to say, on when we provide comments. Now, if students tell us that they don't like the particular parts of the course, we are not likely to change that in the following week, so that they will not see our immediate action. Whereas we want, I think, from students, we want to see the results. But I think in saying that, I think talking about how we are seeking feedback ourselves and not necessarily, asking students about our courses, but also talking about our experiences as as academics, as researchers, curriculum writers, how we are drafting and redrafting our papers, and how we seek and use feedback to improve our work is important in modeling, certain feedback seeking behavior. So I think in that way, I think it is important to share our tribulations and our good and bad experiences with feedback. So to say that, we are in this together, so to say, it's not just the students that are part of the process, but we as educators and researchers, we are involved in different practices that are sometimes better, sometimes worse ourselves. So I think there's definitely value in sharing those experiences.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree.
You agree? Okay. Okay. Just seeing if there's more here. Yes, there are some here. There's another one for you, Bianca, from Naveen Ashawa. In an academic writing course, do you think that feedback for consecutive assignments tasks can be considered ipsative, since there are common repeated skills, that is mechanics, that students need to improve throughout the course? So this is kind of what she's arguing, that there might be de facto ipsative activities without that being a part of the deliberate design.
Well, I think it does seem to me that any kind of, staged assessment, stage formative tasks do have the potential of conducting and integrating ipsative feedback processes. I think these many tasks in academic writing courses are staged, and students, as you said, Naveen, they build on the skills from previous tasks. I think for the ipsative element to be articulated, there needs to be an encouragement for students to actually look back at their previous work and articulate how they have, for example, improved and built on what they didn't achieve in the previous task. So I think, the ipsative process would really be of asking questions about or encouraging students to compare their performance or reflect on how they have improved, which I think sometimes is referred to as what's the word? Something that students do. Well, I can't remember the term, but anyway, some sort of reflection on the work and that how they have grown. That there's definitely many courses, academic writing courses, they do meet the requirement, the first very important requirement of similar tasks, meeting similar learning outcomes. And so secondly, for the ipsative processes to take place, there needs to be encouragement to look back and compare that this student products, so to say. And then I think, yeah, that is great. It's a great. I think these courses are excellent in implementing those different ipsative processes.
Yeah. So basically, if in a course you have completely different tasks, one to the next, then you've designed ipsative feedback out of your course.
No, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we've run out of questions. Anything you want to say as a final comment before we close?
Well, I might just encourage everyone to apply for that wonderful position that you have advertised with Cradle to be part of the feedback literacy. And if you are considering, if anyone here is considering thinking about, pursuing PhD, this is the place to go.
Good.
Highly recommend.
Wonderful ad. Yes. Okay. Any final comment from you, Lasse?
No, not really. Like, everyone's very welcome to reach out if they have any further questions or ideas they want to discuss. So yeah.
Yeah, and I posted the 4 publications from each of you in the chat, and I apologise. I posted it in such a way that you couldn't click on the links. So my apologies for that. I will know how to do it better next time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our presenters, and I look forward to seeing many of you, or not seeing you, but detecting your presence in the seminars to come. Thank you.